Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Friday Symposium. I'm Diane Sare, president of the LaRouche Organization, and today is Friday, April 11th. And what I would like to begin with is not a more general briefing, but to discuss with you an urgent mobilization launched by the LaRouche Organization, the Schiller Institute, the organization in Europe, and around the world regarding the looming ongoing blowout of the transatlantic financial system, which is what's actually going on. Donald Trump's tariffs, although arbitrary and not reciprocal, are not the cause of the crash, which is actually ongoing and has been for some time, just covered up by a lot of currency printing. And therefore, we have released the following statement, which I'm going to bring up here. Wall Street gave us this crisis. LaRouche has the solution. For those of you who followed Lyndon LaRouche for years, you may know that his area of expertise is what's known as physical economy, really the relationship between human creativity and economic growth. And frankly, that's the only kind of economy. Money has no value. And what this document says in the first paragraph is the Western financial system is now teetering at the edge of a general systemic blowout, which is about to usher in a new global Great Depression far worse than that of the 1930s. The skids are being greased by the predatory trade war, which the gullible Trump administration has unleashed against the whole world, but especially China, on the advice of Harvard-trained quacks and hedge fund managers like Stephen Moran. And people may know there was a brawl between Elon Musk and Peter Navarro. Musk rightly denounced him for his Harvard economics degree or whatever his degree is in. I will say we used to have a slogan when a LaRouche candidate ran for mayor in Boston before Hitler. There was Harvard. That's for another time, but Harvard does not produce geniuses in economics or law, and particularly think of Barack Obama. And going on, President Trump seems to intend to free the world from the speculative aspects of globalization, which would be a legitimate effort. But the interpretation that the whole world looted the US, and I have to say, we are not in this situation because the world has been looting the US. We did this to ourselves. I'm just going to go to the next image here, which is LaRouche's famous triple curve formula. This is, or function, this is in the document. He devised this in 1995 to explain that starting over here in the far left end, the three curves of financial aggregates, monetary aggregates, and physical economic output used to be one curve, but this came to be three curves when Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold reserve system. And suddenly you had money generating money, but it had no relationship to the physical productive process. And I will say this is why the great heights of the stock market today actually are in inverse proportion to the real economy. When you see that stock market go up, when you see more money being printed, that is going up because you are literally looting the real physical economy. So the only way to address this situation is by putting the entire system through a form of bankruptcy reorganization, the first step of which is reinstatement of the FDR era Glass-Steagall Act, where the commercial banks are separated by a firewall, no shared personnel, no shared buildings, commercial banks totally separate and protected from the investment banks. If people want to make investments, if they want to play the market, if they want to do whatever, fine, they can do it, but they are assuming the risk. The risk is not going to be passed on to the depositors in that bank or the American taxpayers as a whole. You're going to need solvent, transparent commercial banks that aren't involved in any speculation, because when we nationalize the Federal Reserve and direct credit to doing those things, that will actually solve the economic collapse and will actually bring manufacturing back to the United States. You need a solvent commercial banking system through which that credit can flow, where you're not going to have some speculator skimming off the top or literally looting the whole thing. And that's the way to return manufacturing. Get control of our currency flow, direct the credit. We need energy. We need modern transportation. We need water. You cannot take a factory out of China and plunk it down in the middle of upstate New York. There will not be enough energy, water, or anything else. So if you want to return manufacturing, if you want our nation to be productive, which we should do, the way to do it is to address these physical requirements. And really, that gets me to the topic of this evening's symposium, which is the question of the roots of the American Revolution. We will be taking up more on the American Revolution next week, leading into the April 19th special Manhattan Project meeting on the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord. And I would like to introduce my guest, who happens to be my husband, and he also is a historian, and he is going to tell us something about the history of the United States from the standpoint, unfortunately, that it is mostly not taught today. So, Chris, glad to see you here. Hi, why don't you go ahead?
It's great to be here. Sure. Well, actually, I'm going to speak very little about the United States Republic today. But I want people to have as a thought object that that's where we're going. But I wanted to start from the well, we can bring up the slideshow here in a minute. Start from the that's fine. You can bring that up. Start from the fundamental questions that LaRouche addressed, because I mean, as we go into this 250th anniversary of the founding of the American Republic, the way that LaRouche understood this, and he would often talk about, that he had 2,500 years of Western civilization in his mind, and he had friends like Plato and St. Augustine and Nicholas of Cusa and many, many more who we had never heard of. But these were his friends. And he read their writings, he studied their history, he studied what they did to move mankind forward. And so they were his friends, because that was what LaRouche was all about. That was what Lyndon LaRouche's mission was moving mankind forward. And of course, he recognized the very special role that the United States Republic played and plays in history in terms of its creation. But I wanted to start with some of the fundamental questions here. Here you see a painting of Zeus, the Greek god Zeus. And this is a quote from LaRouche. The great classical Greek dramatist Aeschylus, in his Prometheus trilogy, the ruling evil god, the Olympian Zeus, forbade the summoning of the mortal person's innate power to make fire. Next slide. Oh, we got that mixed up. Go ahead, next slide. So after fashioning man out of clay, Prometheus watches Athena impart reason to his creation being man, and man with reason. So go ahead. So Prometheus went into Zeus's lair and stole fire from Zeus, with the intention of giving that gift to mankind. Go back. For that he was punished very cruelly by Zeus, chained to a rock, and had his liver eaten out every day, and it would grow back. And he was finally unbound, I believe, by Hercules, as the story goes. But this is a very important idea, because it gives you, as LaRouche laid before you, what are the fundamental questions facing mankind, right? The capricious god Zeus versus Prometheus and Athena, and the concept of man with reason and with the power and with scientific and technological progress, because man participates in God, which we'll get to, because this is obviously before Christ. But let's go ahead. So we're still here, before Christ, Plato versus Aristotle. But I want to point out that here's a painting by Raphael, the great Renaissance painter Raphael. And that's where we're going to, is the Renaissance. That's where we're headed in this discussion. And you can see here a detail from the School of Athens. And what do you see? You see Plato on the left-hand side, and he's pointing up. And you see Aristotle on the right-hand side, and he is holding his hand to the earth, basically. This is, and he has this book, because he's a scholastic. He's got this book, which is basically blocking his motion forward. Look at it. Look at Plato moving forward, and he's pointing up, and he's walking forward. Whereas Aristotle is holding his hand out to the realm of sense certainty, and he's holding himself back from moving forward. Well, let's go to the next slide. This is Aristotle's view of human beings. And you can see why throughout history, the oligarchy always preferred Aristotle, loved Aristotle, and hated Plato. In fact, as we know, Socrates was put to death for questioning, for asking questions. So here's what Aristotle says on slavery in Book 5 of his Politics. It is not only necessary but useful, and from the hour of their birth, some are marked out for those purposes and others for the other. And there are many species of both sorts. So it is natural that with the male and the female, the one is superior, the other inferior. The one governs, the other is governed. And the same rule must necessarily hold good with respect to...
I have to interject here that I vehemently disagree with that, but go on.
Well, we're going to disagree with everything this bastard says.
I know, but I'm just making that point. Okay, go ahead.
I disagree with it too, Diane.
Unless the woman is in charge. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, go.
Bring it back up. So naturally it is with the male and the female. The one is superior, the other inferior. The one governs, the other is governed. And the same rule must necessarily hold good with respect to all mankind. Those men, therefore, who are as much inferior to others as the body is to the soul, are to be thus disposed of, as the proper use of them is their bodies, in which their excellence consists. And if what I have said be true, they are slaves by nature, and it is advantageous to them to be always under government. He then is by nature formed a slave who is qualified to become the chattel of another person, and on that account is so, and who has just reason enough to know that there is such a faculty without being endured with the use of it. For other animals have no perception of reason, but are entirely guided by appetite, and indeed they vary very little in their use from each other. For the advantage which we receive from slaves and tame animals arises from the bodily strength administering I couldn't read that bottom line, but it is the intention of nature to make the bodies of slaves and freemen different from each other, that one should be robust for their necessary purposes, the other erect, useless indeed for what slaves are employed in, but fit for civil life. And this is it. It goes, you get the idea. Next slide. Now, I want before, yeah, that's fine.
I just want to go back for a second because, that sounds so much like the argument in the South, doesn't it?
Completely.
For slavery, property, and also whoever it was that wrote that, oh no, the Negro is docile and kind, just like your dog, and therefore you shouldn't abuse them. Really disgusting. Yeah. And there's no difference between man and beast.
Right. There's no difference between man and beast. This is why oligarchs love Aristotle, right? This is why they love him, because that's their view of mankind as well. And that argument has been made again and again and again throughout history by the oligarchy. And I want to point this out. And before we get to the question of Augustine, I don't have any quotes from Plato, but I want people to consider, for example, the Meno dialogue. What's Plato's view of slavery? Well, in the Meno dialogue, it's a slave boy who has no education whatsoever, apparently, who he calls over to solve the doubling of the square problem. And he's able to work through with this slave boy who makes a couple of mistakes, but then finally figures it out. And he has no formal education in geometry. He hasn't gone to the finest academies. He's not from the best families, but he's able to figure out a rather difficult geometric problem, which is not obvious when you look at it. So that's Plato's view, that the mind of a slave is as great as the mind of any other person, and that he is able to figure out complex geometric problems. So absolutely contradictory. Now, the other point I would make, and this is also very important in terms of what we're going to get to later about kings and rulers. What's Plato's view on kings and rulers? Well, take the question of Thrasymachus, right? That Thrasymachus argues that might is right. It's the same argument of the infallibility of a king. A king cannot do wrong because a king cannot do wrong. So if a king burns you at the stake, it is right because the king decided to burn you at the stake, and the king is infallible because he has the power to do it. So Plato argues against the idea of Thrasymachus that might is right. He proves that right is powerful, that the just is powerful. Justice is powerful. So we're gonna get to this later. Let's go on. So Augustine is very important. Augustine considered, of all the pre-Christian philosophers, he considered Plato to be the closest to Christianity in Plato's philosophy. He says, because Plato looks for universals, and Plato is committed to the good, to doing the good, to finding out the good. So just let's go on to the next slide. Now, I'm moving forward, and I want to invite people. One thing I want to say to you is that LaRouche and our movement created an abundance of historical work. Many, many people throughout the last 40 years in our movement have written incredible papers that you can find on the Schiller Institute archive, that you can find on EIR magazine archive. You can just type in Google. There are a series of critical papers that I read, that I just refreshed myself with in going over this class, and I'll talk about a number of them as we go on. But there's this is the 1300s. You have two things that occur which are absolutely catastrophic for Europe. One is the Plantagenets. Edward III decides to launch the 100 Years' War against France. And that's in like 1337. And then in the 1340s, due to this warfare beginning, but also because of speculation, usury from the Venetian banks, Europe is plunged into a dark age, into an economic collapse that then leads to the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague then becomes airborne. So it basically wipes out, in some parts of Europe, it wipes out half of the population. In general, in Europe, it's somewhere between a quarter and a third of the population. So here you have an image of people sick with the bubonic plague. In the image above that, you have burning of Jews alive, because in the insane mindset of the European population, then they blamed Jews irrationally for having brought this plague into Europe. And then you have the insanity of the flagellants over here. So this is a real dark age. People believe that, the way out of this dark age is by whipping yourself. Okay, next slide. Now, Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarca, they had a different idea. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron basically right after the plague. And these are stories that are in Italian. Dante wrote in Italian as well, and Petrarca wrote in Italian, not Latin. They wrote in Italian. And they wrote very, very beautifully in Italian. And these stories were read by the Italian population as a means of uplifting the population. But of course, if you take Dante's Commedia, Dante is a little bit before Boccaccio and Petrarch. But if you look at his Commedia, you have this idea of Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradiso, and this idea of pulling yourself out of hell to paradise. Essentially, a very important idea of the perfectibility of mankind, the perfectibility of a person who decides to not be a beast and stay in hell, but to rise up towards heaven. And so this is a very, very important period. It's the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy. Let's go to the next slide. At the same time, Geert Groot, who is from the Netherlands, from Deventer, Netherlands, he founds the Sisters of the Common Life in 1379. He basically founds it by opening up his house to a few poor women, and he educates them. 1379. And the Brotherhood of the Common Life in 1384, which again is committed to the idea of education of the poor. So, and he's saying that the poor can become ennobled and can develop their minds. And this is, basically unheard of at the time. I mean, 95, 96, 97% of the population in Europe are like beasts. And, they're beasts. They are servants of the oligarchs who run the show. Coming out of this dark age, Pius II, who we're gonna talk about a bit more later, because he was a Renaissance Pope, Piccolomini. He talks about France after this 100 Years' War and the Black Death. He says, France, wasted by such disasters, presented the appearance of a vast desert rather than a kingdom. Cities lay in ruin and stripped of their inhabitants. Farms were in ashes. The country everywhere was laid waste. Nowhere could a small party travel in safety. If a man escapes brigands, he fell among wild beasts. So that's the situation in Europe at the time. And you don't have a nation. France is not a nation at this point. Italy is not a nation at this point. England is not a nation per se. There's a king, but there's also this nobility, this aristocracy, and they basically run the show. And something to think about, which is interesting, because there's a lot of talk about the Magna Carta and how this was so great because it limited the power of the king. Well, the problem with it is that the Magna Carta basically empowered this aristocracy, and they wanted to limit the power of the king because they thought that the king might limit their power and that the king could act on behalf of the general welfare of the people in the realm. So they wanted to stop that. So this thing around the Magna Carta is a total fraud. It's not what people say it is at all. And in fact, at this point, before you have a republic, you're better off with a king that is committed to the general welfare of the people of the nation. Now, the problem with that is that you're not guaranteed that a king is going to be committed to the general welfare of the nation and its people. But this is the fight that's going on here, and you're going to see this discussion of what a king should be. Now, obviously, this is before we have the Republic of the United States, but this is an important discussion going on. Okay, so next slide. So here we go. This is the Plantagenet king Henry V. In 1415, he wins the Battle of Agincourt in France. And so I just want to give you a sense of this. This is an arbitrary series of wars. Instead of building his nation of England, he decides to invade France and wreak havoc over it. And so, next slide. Juxtapose. 1418, Thomas à Kempis, who is from this Brotherhood of the Common Life of Gerhard Groot, he begins to write The Imitation of Christ. And again, what is this? This is for, now, it's not printed yet, obviously, right? Because I'm showing a printed copy here, but these would be copied out. But, the beginning of the printing press comes in fairly soon. But what à Kempis does with this Imitation of Christ is, again, the question of lifting up the average person, lifting up the mind of the average person to imitate Jesus Christ, and the belief that the average person is capable of that. Okay, next slide. All right, so we're back to France, 1420, 2 years after he starts writing The Imitation of Christ, 5 years after the Battle of Agincourt. Henry V moves on to Paris. He conquers Paris. And Charles VI, who is king at the time, he signs the Treaty of Troyes. And the Treaty of Troyes basically says that that the next king of France will be Henry V, that there is no longer a French king of France, that Henry V will become the king of France, or whoever his progeny is. Now, so Henry dies in 1422. Henry VI comes in, and he says he's king of France, but that's disputed by Charles VII, who is the father of Louis XI, Louis XI, who's gonna become an important part of this discussion here. But so Charles still believes he's king of France. Next slide. okay, 6 years later, you see in the center there, at the very top of the blue part, you see Orleans. And you see also the purple part there, Burgundy, right? Now, Burgundy and England are allied together against France at this time. And Orleans is under siege by the British. And the question is, if Orleans is broken, essentially that's it. France could be completely destroyed. Charles VII would have no pretense of being king of France. The British would completely take over. For what? Not to develop France, but just to build this Plantagenet empire. So very, very important here. Joan of Arc, and you can see here. This doesn't have this, but go back one slide. Go back another slide. One more. Okay. At the very bottom here, you see Dom Remy. It's a triangle. That's where Joan of Arc. It's a star. I'm sorry. It's a star in between those rivers. That's where she's born. And the point of this map, and this is a map from one of the articles from the LaRouche publications. The point of this map is that you see how close she is to the Brotherhood influenced monasteries, and she comes out of this teaching of the Sisters of the Common Life, the Brotherhood of the Common Life. Okay, go back to Joan. Okay, great. So Joan of Arc sees that Charles VII is completely, he's not fighting back. She decides that she will go to Orleans and defeat the British. And that's what she does. And I want to read to you the Piccolomini, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who becomes Pope Pius II. He says, the nobles of France were wavering. The populace were attracted by the prospects of a change in government. Charles dispatched heralds to demand surrender and to announce his coronation to the people of Reims. The city sent eminent citizens to request time for consideration, but the Maid gave orders that the envoys should receive no answer. There must be no delay. Everything must be done at the time that God appointed. The Dauphin obeyed the Maid. He detained the envoys, and sending ahead some companies of cavalry, advanced swiftly on the city. Then an extraordinary thing happened, which after generations will not believe. Not a single armed man was to be found at the gate or the city. The citizens in civil dress met them outside the walls. The Dauphin, without conditions, without terms, without the least opposition, passed through the wide open gates. No one protested. No one showed any sign of resentment. After this, the Maid escorted the new king to Lyon. Here, too, they found no resistance. The whole city was open to the king. It was the same as all the towns between Paris and Lyon. The citizens and all the populace poured out to meet them with the wildest rejoicing. Whether her career was a miracle of heaven or a device of men, I should find it hard to say. Some think that when the English cause was prospering and the French nobles at variance among themselves thought no one fit to be commander, one shrewder than the rest evolved the cunning scheme of declaring the Maid that she had been sent by heaven, and that giving her the command she asked for, since there was no man alive who would refuse to have God for his leader. Thus it came about the conduct of the war and the high command were entrusted to a girl. This at any rate is beyond question, that it was the Maid under whose command the siege of Orleans was raised, by whose arms all the countries between Bourges and Paris were subdued, by whose advice Reims was recovered and the coronation celebrated there, by whose charge Talbot was routed and his army cut to pieces, by whose daring the gate of Paris was fixed, by whose quick wit the untiring effort the French cause was saved, is a phenomenon that deserves to be recorded, although after ages are like to regard it with much wonder, with more wonder than credulity. So, so France is, you can see that this picture on the left, this is where in Reims, where Charles VII is coronated as the King of France due to her amazing work. Now later on, she continues to fight, and she's continuing to try to free all of France, and she's captured. She's captured by the Burgundians. Next slide. And Charles VII betrays her. He does nothing to defend her. She's captured by the Burgundians. She's captured by the Inquisition, and she is put to death at the stake. Now, Gerson, who was at the University of Paris, he defends her, and he's a Platonic scholar who actually creates a guide of study for Louis XI. And Louis XI has been sent, you can go to the next slide. Actually, go back. Sorry. No, go back. Louis XI has been sent to, he's been sent to the southern part of France by his father. And he's very, very upset. We're going to get to this later, but he's very upset because he sees his father not fighting at all. This is later in the 40s, the 1440s, 1450s. But we'll go back to this. But I want to now move on. Now we're going to bring in Nicholas of Cusa, which Bob Wester and I have done a series of classes on the United States history, and we've often started with Cusa. But I wanted to give people a sense of where Cusa fits into history, because he didn't just pop out of nowhere. There's a lot happening here with the Renaissance, with the fight for the Renaissance, with the fight for the nation state that he is a part of. So Nicholas of Cusa writes. Go ahead to the next slide. He writes in 1434 the Concordancia Católica, and here he lays out some very, very critical ideas that you're going to see. I mean, you'll hear in them, as we've pointed out many, many times. You'll hear echoed in the Declaration of Independence many, many years later, 400 years later. Natural law proceeds all human considerations and provides the principle for them all. First, nature intends every kind of animal to preserve its physical existence and its life, to avoid what could be harmful, and to secure what is necessary to it. For the first requirement of essence is that it exist. But from the beginning, men have been endowed with reason, which distinguishes them from animals. They know, because of the existence of their reason, that association and sharing are most useful, indeed necessary for their self-preservation and to achieve the purpose of human existence. Therefore, by natural instinct, they have joined together and built villages and cities in which to live together. And if men had not established rules to preserve peace, the corrupt desires of many would have prevented this union from improving human life. For this reason, cities arose in which the citizens united and adopted laws with the common assent of all to preserve unity and harmony. And they established guardians of these laws with the power necessary to provide for the public good. Next slide. It was clear that by a marvelous and beneficent divine law infused in all men, not the upper 1-2%, in all men, they knew that associating together would be most beneficial to them, and that social life would be maintained by laws adopted with the common consent of all, or at least with the consent of the wise and illustrious and the agreement of the others. So even if you have wise people that consent, it must be agreed to by all of mankind. Servitude can be by choice. It is less worthy if by compulsion, and better if freely chosen, since good is more meritorious when performed freely than out of necessity. For nature does not make a slave, but ignorance, nor does manumission make one free, but learning. So the Renaissance, learning, science, progress. But there are no natural slaves. Aristotle's wrong. For those who live by the law are free, but true law is righteousness. True law is not carved on tablets nor cut in bronze, but stamped on the mind and imprinted on the senses. Next slide. All legitimate power arises from elective concordance and free submission. There is in the people a divine seed by virtue of their common equal birth and the equal natural rights of all men, so that the authority which comes from God, as does man himself, is recognized as divine when it arises from the common consent of the subjects. One who is established in authority as representative of the will of all may be called a public or common person, the father of all, ruling without haughtiness or pride in a lawful and legitimately established government, while recognizing himself as a creature of all his subjects as a collectivity. Let him act as their father as individuals. It is sufficient to know that free election based on natural and divine law does not originate from positive law nor from any man upon whose will the validity of the election depends. This is particularly true of the election of a king or emperor whose existence and power do not depend on any one man. Thus, the electors derive their basic authority fundamentally from the common consent of all those who could by natural law have created the emperor, and not the Roman pontiff, who has no authority to give any region in the world a king or emperor without its consent. Next slide. For this purpose, the public welfare, the ruler should have the best qualified of his subjects chosen from all parts of his realm to participate in daily council with him. So this idea of a counselor counseling the king, these counselors ought to represent all the inhabitants of the realm, representative government. These counselors ought constantly to defend the good of the public, which they represent, giving audience and serving as the appropriate means through which the king can govern and influence his subjects, and the subjects on proper occasion can influence him in return. The great strength of the kingdom comes from this daily council. The counselors should be appointed to this task by agreement in a general meeting of the kingdom, and they should be publicly bound legally by oath to speak out openly for the public good. Next slide. So he writes this in 1434. In 1439, Cusa and a number of his friends like Albergati, they bring in the representatives from the Byzantine Empire, and they pull together the Council of Florence, and the dome that you see there is actually finished in 1436. So 3 years before this glorious Council of Florence, you have this beautiful dome completed by Brunelleschi, lifting up to the heavens the citizens of Florence, lifting up to look up in this beautiful dome. And so the Council of Florence proceeds, and you see Platon there, who's brought in by John VIII, who's the Byzantine emperor. And Platon brings with him the works of Plato. Now, we still had some works of Plato in Western Europe at the time, but we didn't have all of them. Platon brings in the complete works of Plato in Greek, and what occurs at this Council of Florence is that the Eastern Church and the Western Church come together, and they come together on the principle of the filioque, that God proceeds through to the Son to mankind through the Son, but through the Holy Spirit. That therefore there's a direct link between God and mankind through Jesus Christ, which this filioque had been rejected by the Byzantine Church. Well, at this Council of Florence, under this Renaissance rebirth and Platonic rebirth, the two churches are united around this concept of the filioque, which is an absolutely beautiful thing. Next slide. Now, the Medicis, Cosimo Medici on the extreme left there, that's the founding Medici, Cosimo de' Medici. That's his son in the center, and that's his grandson, Lorenzo the Great Medici. And these, the Medicis, they were bankers, but they were financiers of the Renaissance. In fact, Cosimo de' Medici, I believe it was him, who said, I much prefer to spend money than to make money. Well, what he spent money on was creating the academy, the Platonic Academy in Florence. He spent money on artists. He spent money on poets. So de' Medici created the first public library in Florence at San Marco. And this was a critical library for the Renaissance movement. And Cosimo attended lectures by Gemistos Plenthon, the Greek who brought the Platonic dialogues over. And he was supported by Marsilio Ficino. And Ficino actually translated, he did the first Latin translations of the complete works of Plato from the Greek. And so that was what was done at this Florentine, in this Florentine Platonic Academy. Next slide. So, okay, now 1447, Louis is in exile from France, but he is ruling Dauphine, which is a state. And you can see that state is very, very close to Italy. It's right next to Italy. And you have a constant back and forth of this Italian Renaissance and Platonic thinking with Louis XI, the Dauphin, who will become Louis XI. So I want to give you a sense of how this worked. I mean, there's a direct link here with Cusa, the Council of Florence, the Platonic Academy, and the effect on Louis XI. So go ahead to the next slide. Now here is Pope Pius II Piccolomini. I just want to show you him. He is a Renaissance Pope. He is he's critical in this whole development of the Renaissance. And I think, one thing I would just appeal to people is that you may not think of the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, or the Dutch Renaissance, or the English Renaissance, which we'll get to in a bit. You may not think of them as part of America. They absolutely are. They're what we come from. And you should immerse yourself in this beauty, beautiful architecture, beautiful art, beautiful poetry. Get to know these people, become familiar with them, become familiar with the artwork. So that's my appeal. Next slide. So you can see here, Burgundy. Now, Louis XI, he actually goes north at a certain point, up into Burgundy, which at this point includes the Netherlands and the Flemish area. So there's a number of things that occur in this period. In 1456, Joan of Arc is exonerated, completely exonerated. So this creates a massive optimism in the French population that Joan of Arc is exonerated, and there's a series of battles that are now fought, which free France from the British, and you also have the friends of Cusa, etc., who organize this thing called the Congress of Arras, which gets the Burgundians to break from the English, and they join with France. So just something to know there. While Louis XI is up in this northern Burgundian area, he meets with a gentleman named John Wessel of Gansforth, who's a personal friend of Thomas à Kempis, who wrote the Imitation of Christ, as we talked about earlier. He had been educated by the Brotherhood of Common Life in Deventer, and he was particularly involved. Gansforth was involved in this Florentine-born movement to seek out and translate the original Greek texts of both the New Testament and classical Greek masters, most notably Plato. So again, Louis XI is imbued in this Renaissance outlook. Now, one interesting. Okay, so go to the next slide. Okay, good. So Louis XI becomes king in 1461. His father, Charles VII, dies, and he becomes king. And France is liberated. It's now a complete nation. At this very same year, I will just mention that Jasper Tudor, the uncle of the future King of England, Henry VII, who's also a nation builder, very much inspired by Louis XI, he flees England to France, and Louis XI makes Jasper Tudor a member of his household. He comes back 10 years later and brings Henry VII, the young Henry VII, to France. So Henry VII sees what Louis XI does. Now, I don't want to go into a lot of details on this, but what Louis XI took the idea of the development of the city-state, what he had done in Dauphiny, basically when he was king there, or the ruler of Dauphiny, he created a postal system. He started developing all kinds of industry, etc., promoting industry. Well, when he becomes king, and this is a class in itself. I mean, in other words, I'm just trying to give you a sketch. So many of these things, the Council of Florence, the question of Louis XI, these are classes in themselves. And I really, appeal to people to study all of these things and become really familiar with them. And we have to do classes on these things, and we have to get this out to people to know. But Louis XI, he breaks the control of these little principalities and these little oligarchies. He truly becomes king of all of France. And you'll hear later from his letter that he wrote, or his book that he wrote to his son, who becomes Charles VIII, called The Rosebush of War, his view of what it is to be king, which is very, very beautiful and ennobled idea. And so he brings in, as king, he brings in all kinds of people from around Europe. He brings people in from Florence. He brings in industrialists from Germany, from what would become Germany later. And he rebuffs an alliance with Venice, with the Venetians. And they cut short their visit and they go back home. And I will read to you, because he shared the view of Pius II, this Renaissance Pope. Here's what Pius says about the Venetians. As among brute beasts, aquatic creatures have the least intelligence, so among human beings the Venetians are the least just and the least capable of humanity. They please only themselves, and while they talk, they listen to and admire themselves. When they speak, they think themselves sirens. They wish to appear Christian before the world, but in reality they never think of God, and except for the state, which they regard as a deity, they hold nothing sacred. The Venetians aim at the domination of Italy, and all but dare aspire to mastery of the world. And this is going to be very important because the Venetians play a very destructive role in this story. And, we've written, there's an article that I want to go back and read, but there's a number of articles. Jerry Rose, who may want to give a class on this, wrote an article about the Venetian takeover of England, which we'll get to a bit here. But anyway, yeah?
We have 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Yes.
Okay, 10 minutes. Okay, well, he enacted labor laws that protected the rights of foreign workers, Louis XI. He set standards of production. He encouraged immigration of engineers, printers, musicians, farmers, armor manufacturers, artillery specialists, iron foundry workers, copper workers. You get the idea. All kinds of internal improvements, massive amounts of development of France. So I'll leave it at that because there could be much more. I'll leave it at that on Louis XI. But I want to just read to you a couple of things that he wrote to his son on his deathbed in 1483 in this book called The Rose Bush of War. And we have this translated in Fidelio. You can read it. But he says, the greatest care a wise man must have in this transitory world is for his soul, which is perpetual and which bears the charge for the activities of the body, which shall rot upon death, which spares neither the great nor insignificant, noble nor villain, strong nor weak, rich man nor poor, old nor young. All are equal before it. And so it gives no more time or better forewarning to one than to the other, for which reason each should seek to have a good soul and not put his heart too much in the world or its goods, which he must leave fully behind. Death is a light thing to him who is certain that after him good will come of it, for who lives a good life will die a good death. We must not love this world except in doing good, because life in this world is brief and affliction endless, which shall be brought upon those who have not lived rightly. So this is good advice for his son who's going to become king. But you see how he thinks. Since everything, including our creations, comes from God, we must desire that our souls return to him by doing such good works, that the memory of them will be in perpetual benediction. It is a good and charitable thing to risk one's life to defend the common good, which concerns all estates, that is, the commonwealth of the realm. Consider the duty of kings and princes and their cavaliers, that their estate and vocation is to defend the common good, both ecclesiastic and secular, to uphold justice and peace among their subjects. And it goes on like this. When kings have no regard for the law, they deny the people that they ought to have left to them, and do not give them that which they should have, and in so doing make the people serfs, and lose the name of king. For no man should be called king, but he who rules and has seigniory over free men. For free men of their nature love their lords, while serfs naturally hate them, like slaves hate their masters. And there's just one other section in here. See if I can find it. Yeah, he goes on to say, the prince must provide for the maintenance of public works and edifices, and make improvements and repairs on roads, bridges, ports, the walls, the moats, and other things in the towns and castles which are necessary, in such a manner that the people not be aggrieved, and by this create committed loyal men. Build the nation. Okay, go on to the next slide. So Henry VII, as we talked about, he comes in. He's steeped in this Louis XI tradition, and he comes in to as King of England as a tutor. He's not a Plantagenet. He's the first Tudor king. He comes in. He defeats Richard III in battle. Go to the next slide. And a Renaissance is started under Henry VII in England, which basically picks up from where Louis XI left off in France. And this Renaissance, again, is a Platonic Renaissance led by Sir Thomas More, Erasmus of Rotterdam, John Colet, and I have the same painter up there at the top. He painted and drew these, and his name is escaping me right now, but that's okay. Anyway, this Renaissance, again, these are Platonists. The Platonic tradition in Erasmus, you see in his all of his writings, he's constantly talking about. Well, again, Erasmus comes out of the Brotherhood of the Common Life also, just to know, right? He, from the Netherlands, he is directly educated by the Brotherhood of the Common Life. And he is advising Henry VII, John Colet advising Henry VII, Thomas More advising Henry VII. So Henry VII is being organized by these Platonists and develops the nation. Now, this is the painter there is Hans Holbein the Younger. So I'll just go one thing in this book. You may have heard of this book by Thomas More called Utopia. In Utopia, More develops the idea that government must promote the general welfare of all its citizens, a common theme that we see here in this Renaissance conception, right? To achieve this goal would require that all the nation's citizens be schooled to become Platonic philosopher kings, as More states, for it is impossible that all should be well unless all men are good. So the utopian, I don't know, it's something definitely to strive for, isn't it? More wrote Utopia as a form of dialogue between himself and a fictional character named Raphael, who has sailed both geographically and intellectually as Ulysses and Plato. More says that Raphael has studied philosophy, learning Greek, since the Romans left us nothing that is valuable except Seneca and Cicero. So again, this question of learning Greek and learning Plato. Raphael describes More the imaginary land of Utopia, which has achieved a far higher level of civilization than that of Europe at the time. He writes this in 1516. Go to the next slide. So Henry VII gives birth to Henry VIII, and Henry VIII continues working with More and Erasmus for a while, but he gets seduced literally by the Venetians. And when More refuses to recognize his marriage, because he divorces his wives and he has them beheaded, and when More refuses to recognize his marriage, More is sent to the chopping block. And you see the beginning of the Venetian takeover of England at this point. So that's where I want to leave it off. We'll pick it up. Lowry wrote How the Nation Was Won, the Elizabethan period, Shakespeare. And it's interesting, this question of utopia, because one thing to think about in Shakespeare, when he writes The Tempest, 100 years later, this is after you had after John Smith went to Virginia, and it's the same kind of thing where is utopia America as far as More thinks. I mean, maybe not literally, but he's thinking, maybe we have to get out of here in order to actually establish a republic. So that's what I wanted to present, and we'll continue from there. Hope that was interesting.
We'll have part two, I
Yeah.
think we'll have to, because I think people can hear, you hear the foreshadowing, I guess I'll put it that way, pre-echoes. I don't know what you call an echo that comes before something instead of after, but that's
Right.
what we hear in this. So we will have more next week with a special guest, which I'm not announcing, so everyone will have to stay tuned. And I do hope people in the New York City area register for the April 19th in-person event. And there will be an event also in the Boston area. So people in the Boston area, if you want information on these things, you better write into the LaRouche.org, visit the website, sign up and get our information. And thanks very much, Chris. We should
Thank you. And a special shout out to Stephanie Ezrall and Pierre Baudry and all the people that took the time who wrote these articles. And people
great.
should read them and study them.
Yes.